Spoiled teen humiliates his black teacher, regrets it when only she shows up for him. Before we get into the story, drop a comment and tell us, where in the world are you watching from today? Ruth Evans first laid eyes on the building of St. Augustine Preparatory School. That Monday morning, just as the Virginia fog was reluctantly lifting from the roads, beads of moisture clung to the car windows, drawing ghostly patterns, like the world itself wasn't quite ready to reveal this school in full. The complex rose in the distance like a fortress, sharp red brick, white columns, and tall stained glass windows glinting with the solemn faces of saints. It looked less like a place of learning and more like a monument to the old world, still clutching its ideals like a Bible pressed tight to the chest. She wasn't just the new teacher. She was something else entirely. The first black woman ever hired by a school that had, for generations, opened its doors only to white children and only to white faculty. Even the groundskeepers, gardeners, janitors, white. It was tradition here in the Deep South, where tradition often wore a disguise stitched from fear. And Ruth Evans was the disruption those traditions could smell from a mile away. She stepped out of her car with the same quiet precision she used stepping into every new classroom she'd ever taught in. Her posture was erect, her gaze alert, like a soldier entering occupied territory. Her skin was deep and smooth, her hair set carefully, her lips painted a firm burgundy that matched her expression. Focused, unreadable. Her coat, navy blue with silver buttons, had been tailored by a friend who believed in presentation as armor. In her hand, she carried a worn leather bag packed with folders full of lesson plans, annotated texts, and a few typed quotes she liked to read before tough days. Today qualified, the front foyer smelled of varnished wood, dusted encyclopedias, and stale pipe tobacco. That smell, the scent of authority, of age, of systems that didn't like being questioned, hit her the second she entered. John Kramer, the school's headmaster, met her near the office door. He was tall, thin, his gray hair precisely parted, and his handshake was as brief and cool as a church doorknob in winter. "Welcome," he said without meaning it. Then he walked her to her classroom, never breaking stride, never once asking how she felt or what she needed. The halls were immaculate. Not a scuff on the polished floors, not a single torn poster or crooked bulletin board. The walls were lined with framed photos of graduating classes, all white boys in matching tuxedos, their smiles brittle and proud. Their eyes followed her, like statues in a museum guarding something precious. The teachers she passed either buried their noses deeper into paperwork or offered her those strained, overly polite nods that tried to say, "We're civilized," while their eyes muttered something else. Only one woman, Sylvia Haynes, broke the silence. Sylvia was a plump woman in a tweed jacket with gentle features and a whispery voice that made everything sound like a bedtime story. "If you need anything, chalk, paper, quiz cards, just ask," she murmured, eyes averted. But the next day in the lunchroom, she walked right past Ruth without so much as a glance. At 8:30, Ruth stood outside her new classroom. She'd prepared for this moment the way other people prepared for storms. She adjusted her shoulders, steadied her breath, and walked in. 16 students, white, well-dressed, polished shoes and starched collars, the sons and daughters of judges, lawyers, politicians, children raised to believe the world would yield to them. And in the middle of the second row, a boy sat with his arms folded across his chest like a shield. Harry Miller. He didn't stand when she entered. Everyone else rose out of habit, but Harry stayed put, leaning back in his chair like he owned the air around him. His ash blonde hair was slicked just like in the newspaper photos of his father, State Senator Walter Miller. His face was all angles and judgment, his expression carved in open contempt. He didn't say a word during the lesson, didn't lift his eyes. He just tapped his nails on the desk, slow and deliberate, until one of the other boys, Danny, leaned in and muttered, "You should have stayed where you belong, Miss Evans." Quiet enough to seem harmless, loud enough to hurt. The room crackled with it. By Wednesday, Ruth arrived early to prep the classroom. When she opened the door, the smell hit first, sharp and chemical like gasoline. Her eyes landed on the writing before her brain could catch up. Black marker. Slurs covered the walls. Go back where you came from. You don't belong here. The worst was written in large block letters across the chalkboard, exactly where she liked to begin each lesson. SLAVE. Beneath it, someone had drawn crude shackles, chains, manacles, even a whip. She froze, not because she was surprised, but because in that moment, her hands wanted to do something she couldn't afford. Her fingers tightened around her leather bag. Her breathing stayed even, but her skin prickled like heat rising from pavement. Then she moved. She walked up to the board, erased most of the graffiti, but left that one word. Slave. She picked up the chalk and, in neat, elegant script, wrote beneath it, every generation has its slaves. Some just happen to teach others how to be free. Later, in the teacher's lounge, she heard whispers. She probably wrote that herself, just to make a scene. Maybe this place isn't the right fit for her anyway. They didn't speak to her, just near her. Loud enough for her to hear, but quiet enough to deny. Her presence was treated not like inclusion, but like intrusion. That Friday the parents held a meeting. She hadn't been told about it. She found out only when she passed the front office and saw them. Mothers with pearl brooches, fathers in tailored suits, storming out with pinched expressions. One man stood out, red-faced, broad-shouldered, loud. This isn't about progress, he barked. It's about tearing down tradition. Later she learned his name, Walter Miller, Harry's father. No one said a word to her, not the principal, not Sylvia, not the other teachers. Just silence, thick and deliberate. But Ruth came back every morning. She wiped the desk clean, picked up the crumpled papers thrown like insults. She taught, she read, she explained. Not a single face in that classroom softened, but that didn't matter. Change didn't happen with applause. Sometimes it looked like isolation. Sometimes it looked like hate scrawled in ink. But if you scrub long enough, day after day, eventually all that's left is knowledge. And Ruth Evans knew exactly why she was there. When Ruth Evans crossed the grounds of St. Augustine, yet again, the asphalt under her heels felt unnervingly smooth, too polished, too clean. It was like walking in an operating room where every glance was a scalpel, every whisper a cut. There was no dirt here, but the cold. There was too much of it, and it had nothing to do with the weather. With each passing day, the school's classical architecture, the Gothic windows, the stone arches, the ivy creeping up the walls, stopped feeling like a symbol of enlightenment. Instead, it became a fortress of alienation. She no longer saw the nobility in the brickwork, the elegance of the stained glass windows in the chapel. All she saw were the shadows behind the curtains, where eyes, both adult and child, watched her as she walked by. A single detail was enough for them to see her as the other. The color of her skin was enough for them to consider her unworthy. By Friday morning, 2 weeks after the graffiti incident, Ruth seemed the same on the surface, still walking with military precision, her shoulders still straight, her hair braided tightly as always. But beneath that posture, fatigue had settled in, not from sleepless nights, but from the constant, silent battle that drained her. Each day, walking into her classroom, she checked the walls, as if hoping the words monkey or go back to your jungle would vanish. But they were still there. They'd simply been wiped from the board and carried over to the desks, the books, the air. Her students came into the classroom every day with the same expression on their faces, a mix of arrogance and disgust, as if it was somehow beneath them for her to stand at the front of the room. Harry Miller, as usual, walked in last, casually dropping his bag on the nearest desk, and sat back in his chair, deliberately not standing when she entered. It wasn't a protest. It was an assertion of his own superiority. He knew he could get away with it. Harry was handsome. There was no denying that. Tall, with light blonde hair, sharp features, and piercing, almost icy blue eyes. He wore shirts with the sleeves rolled up, like the world itself bent to his will. Even the dress code. He chewed gum with a nonchalance, fiddled with a pen, leaned back in his chair as if every movement whispered, "I'm not here to listen to you." When Ruth asked questions, he answered, but always with that subtle, dismissive tone that made his words sound like an insult. He'd call her Miss Evans, but the way he said it, soft, mocking, turned respect into a joke. "You must have read Whitman pretty shallow at your last school," he remarked one day when Ruth asked them to explain an allusion in one of his poems. A few students snickered. Annabelle, the dark-haired daughter of one of the county judges, gave Harry a look of approval. Pages rustled in the back. Ruth didn't respond. She just gave Harry a long, silent stare. Neither angry nor surprised, just steady. The kind of look that made teenagers feel exposed. After class, she walked into the hallway, clutching a worn notebook full of scribbled notes. The school walls felt like they were closing in on her, giving her no room to breathe. The old wooden panels released a faint scent of wax and time. The stained glass windows let in dim light. Dust particles floating like forgotten memories. Whispers. There were always whispers. Between classrooms, in the locker rooms, around corners. The teachers didn't speak to her outside of faculty meetings, and Principal John Kramer, when he saw her, was polite, but avoided eye contact, as though he feared his gaze would burn him. Sylvia Haynes, the older history teacher, had shown sympathy at first. On her first day, she even brought Ruth a muffin and left it on her desk. But now as she passed by, Sylvia only offered a barely perceptible nod, enough to pass for accidental. She'd received a letter from the parent committee, one that subtly implied that supporting this experimental teacher could be seen as unprofessional. Sylvia had a pension in her future and a home in Roanoke. Ruth understood, but it still hurt. That evening, everything changed when Ruth was walking through the empty corridor, headed back to grab some forgotten papers. Her footsteps echoed in the silence. Near the landing, beneath the old poster that read, "Valor, Wisdom, Honor," she heard a soft, muffled sob. Looking up, she saw Harry. He was facing the wall, his forehead pressed against it, fists clenched at his sides. His shoulders trembled. It was strange to see him without that air of superiority. His body shook, like a string pulled too tight, ready to snap. He didn't notice her at first. When he turned around, his eyes were red. For a brief second, their gazes met. And in that moment, Harry seemed to see her, not just as a teacher, not just as a black woman, but as a person, maybe for the first time. But then he recoiled. His face froze into a mask of hatred, as though her presence exposed his vulnerability. He shot her a look that was part desperation, part disdain, then turned and hurried off, disappearing around the corner, leaving only the echo of his steps and the damp marks of his fingerprints on the wall. Ruth stood still, not following him, not calling out. She just stood there, looking into the dark hallway where no one else was. And in that silence, for the first time, she felt no triumph, no sympathy, but a sense of foreboding, as if beneath all that fury, something much more fragile was hiding. October dampness settled over Ashwood. The sky above the town had lost its summer clarity, and now, weary and low, hung heavy above their heads. Gray, soggy, uninspiring. The leaves on the trees lining Main Street, once copper and gold, now appeared muddied brown, stuck together from the rain. The brick sidewalks glistened with slick patches underfoot. The air smelled of wet earth, cigarettes, and musty paper, a familiar scent in old buildings where windows hadn't been opened in years to keep autumn from creeping inside. St. Augustine's school felt like a relic, stubbornly embedded in the present. The white columns, neatly trimmed lawns, freshly painted doors, everything seemed to showcase resilience against the winds of change, as though the very building itself resisted what was happening in the country. It was a place of tradition, where the past was revered as a virtue and anything foreign was viewed as a threat. Ruth Evans felt this with every step she took. She had already learned to predict where the students would be whispering in the corners of the hallways, where the teachers would shift aside just enough for her not to pass too close. Each of her days began with a check of the classroom, making sure there were no new slurs on the board, no books defaced, no chalk stolen again. It had become routine, but behind her outward calm was a barely contained ache, fatigue from having to hold her dignity in place at all times. In the morning, she'd look into the mirror, adjust her blouse collar, and repeat to herself like a prayer, "You're not here for them. You're here for the truth, for those who come after you." By the third week of October, the first round of exams began. For the students, it was a turning point, the moment when carelessness gave way to tension. The hallways buzzed with teenagers who looked half asleep, their notebooks covered in scribbles. But Harry Miller remained an island of calm in the middle of this chaos, at least on the surface. He still sauntered into class as if he owned it, still refused to write down assignments, still ignored Ruth as though she was nothing more than a minor glitch in his perfectly tuned world. But Ruth knew this was just the facade. She'd seen it the moment she found him crying in the hallway. Since then, Harry's gaze had changed. He avoided her eyes, but when they crossed paths in the hall, there was a flicker of something like anxiety in them. He used to look at her like she was an irrelevant piece of furniture. Now he looked at her as if she was a threat to his fragile stability. A week later, Ruth was called to Principal Kramer's office. As usual, John Kramer behaved as though he were speaking to a sick relative, someone you were ashamed of but had to endure. He peppered his speech with apologetic pauses and careful phrasing, as though choosing his words with tongs, careful not to offend anything too important. "Miss Evans," he began, "you know we uphold high academic standards, but unfortunately we've received some complaints about your literature class, particularly from Mr. Miller's parents. They claim their son is suffering from a biased approach." Ruth's expression didn't change. She listened as if she had known exactly what he would say. Inside, she felt calm but cold. It was like staring at a thin layer of ice, knowing dangerous waters flowed underneath. Harry was indeed starting to falter. His work had become sloppy, his answers shallow, and his participation in class was more of a performance in passivity. It was as if he were doing everything he could to show that this subject meant nothing, and his teacher was a mistake. But beneath that, there was something else. He wasn't understanding the material, he wasn't reading, and no one was trying to help him. In the teacher's lounge, Ruth overheard teachers speaking about him with weariness. Some shrugged, "He's long since written himself off." Others whispered, "Walter Miller has connections. We can't afford to fail his son." Sylvia Haynes, the same one who had brought Ruth a muffin in the beginning, now only offered a silent nod when their paths crossed. One evening, when the sun had dipped below the line of pines behind the stadium and the school building was emptying out, Ruth heard a knock on her door. Standing in the doorway was Harry, hesitant, like a kid who forgot the secret word to get inside. He wouldn't meet her gaze, hands shoved into his jacket pockets, as though they could hide all his embarrassment. "I need a plan," he started, but trailed off. Ruth didn't let him finish. She just nodded and walked over to her desk, grabbing a fresh sheet of paper. She didn't ask questions. She knew that his visit, this crack in the wall he'd built between himself and reality, was already something significant. He came back again and again. Not every day, not on any schedule. Sometimes he just sat there, listening as she dissected texts by Faulkner or Hughes. Other times he asked questions, awkward, disjointed, but real. He wasn't trying to sound smart. He just wanted to understand. One day, staying after class, he asked her why she had decided to become a teacher, especially here. She gave a simple answer. Because no one should have to learn to live in a lie, and school is the most treacherous place where a lie can take root. He fell silent, watching her hands. Thin, strong, with calluses on her fingers from chalk and paper. But beneath these meetings, there was a rising tension. In class, Harry had hardly changed. He still looked away, still didn't sit down first. The other students noticed the shift, how he lingered after the bell, how he disappeared behind the door to her classroom. And the whispers started. In the cafeteria, someone slipped him a note. Too warm to the N-words. Contagious? Someone had drawn a silly caricature on his locker. Harry kneeling before a black woman holding a book. The caption read, Literary Slave. He tore the drawing off, crumpled it, and threw it away. But not a word was spoken, not to his friends, not to his parents. He kept it inside because he knew that to admit it was to admit that everything he'd been taught was falling apart. One evening at home during dinner, his father asked, Is it true you're taking extra lessons from, and didn't finish, from her? Harry shrugged. It's just literature. Senator Miller set his fork down on the edge of his plate and leaned forward. You'll have teachers, you'll have coaches, but never forget who you are and who they are. Those words struck Harry like nails. They rang in his head as he watched Ruth explain the structure of tragedy. They rang when he tried to understand why her voice sounded sincere, while his father's voice was hollow and oppressive. It had been just over 2 months since the school year started. Autumn in Ashwood was nearing its peak. The trees near the historic campus of St. Augustine Preparatory School were turning blood red and burnt yellow. Leaves fell onto the brick walkways like ash on a slowly smoldering fire. The school, majestic and unapproachable from a distance, hid a painful crack beneath its Gothic facade, old as Virginia itself, barely covered by a thin layer of decency. At the center of this crack were Ruth Evans and Harry Miller, two people who had less in common with each passing day, but whose connection was growing deeper. Ruth arrived in her classroom before anyone else. She silently opened the shutters, letting in the pale morning light. The room still smelled faintly of old dust, ink, and a barely noticeable hint of chalk with the past lessons written on the board. Faulkner, the voice of the South. Gothic allegory in the fall of the House of Usher. The steady rhythm of work kept her balanced, but she didn't deceive herself. She was still unwelcome here. The teachers had started to avoid her, not sharply, not out of hostility, but with deliberate politeness, as if her presence disrupted the balance of their usual order. Sylvia Haynes, who had once been warm, now didn't even meet her eyes in the teacher's lounge. The estrangement had thickened to the point where it was almost physical, like a damp fog settling on her shoulders. The students followed the adults' lead. Teenagers, who were better at reading the mood than any device, had learned to fall silent when she entered the room and stopped raising their hands even when they knew the answer. The only exception was Harry Miller, but ironically not because of merit. He no longer openly insulted her, no longer argued for the sake of arguing, but his silence carried the same ironic hostility. He sat with his leg draped over his knee, facing away from the others, as if to say, I'm only here in body. And then, one gray Monday, he stayed after the bell. He began, but faltered. His lips trembled. It was like he was trying to swallow a word that wouldn't go down. Ruth didn't respond right away. She opened her desk drawer and pulled out a thin folder, filled with essay samples, and placed it on the desk in front of him. She didn't look him in the eye, simply said, If you want, I'll help, but we're short on time, and I don't waste mine on people who aren't willing to work. He didn't answer, just nodded and left. But the next day he returned, and the next. That's how their sessions began, quiet, tense, almost ceremonial. Harry sat with his lips pressed together, eyes lowered. while Ruth patiently worked through To Kill a Mockingbird, Lord of the Flies, and short stories by Langston Hughes. He spoke little, but soaked it all in, even the things he pretended not to notice. The first weeks were filled with mistrust. Harry tested Ruth's limits. A biting comment here, a show of exaggerated exhaustion there. She, however, didn't raise her voice. She dissected his thoughts piece by piece. One day he tried quoting Shakespeare, hoping to catch her in a mistake. She interrupted without looking at her notes. That's not Hamlet, that's Macbeth. And here's how it goes in the original. Life's but a walking shadow. Harry lowered his gaze. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Respect or, perhaps, for the first time in his life, shame. But the school wasn't asleep. A week after he started attending extra sessions, a note appeared in his locker. Know-it-all on a leash with Auntie. Whispers filled the classrooms. Laughter was particularly loud when he passed through the halls. One day, someone threw a crumpled notebook at him, with a drawing of a monkey wearing glasses on the cover. Ruth didn't ask, but she knew. She saw how Harry clenched his fists, how he gritted his teeth, trying not to show any emotion. This wasn't just defiance, it was pain. Not the kind you can show, but the kind that burrows deep, like a slow burn that eats away at pride from the inside. One day when Harry came in later than usual, his lips split. He didn't sit down right away. He stood there silently until Ruth asked, "Are you okay?" He was silent for a few seconds, then whispered, "Doesn't matter." She understood. If she asked too many questions, he would leave. So she just nodded. The lesson continued. There was no friendship in their interactions, not even warmth. There was only honesty, heavy, abrasive, like sandpaper. Ruth didn't dumb things down for him. She didn't give him any special treatment because of his privilege. When he slacked off, she called him out. When he gave a precise answer, she didn't praise him. But there was something in her voice, acknowledgement. He felt it. For Harry, Ruth became a mirror he didn't want to look into, but couldn't stop staring at. In her, he saw a woman who knew literature better than anyone in the school. A woman who wasn't trying to be one of the guys, because she knew she never would be. A woman who wasn't afraid of him, his father, or anyone else. Not because she was a hero, but because she simply had no other choice. Deep down, Harry knew that everything he'd been taught at home, about order, hierarchy, his place, was crumbling as he watched Ruth dissect a metaphor in James Baldwin. And the more he attended their sessions, the more that inner tension grew. He hated this duality, hated that he had started to respect her. Ruth, however, watched him like a sick tree trying to push out new growth through the blackness of rot. She didn't allow herself to feel anything. She knew if she showed weakness, she would lose it all. But one day when he asked a question, not about the material, just offhand, almost a whisper, she set the book down for a moment. He asked, "Why did you even come here?" Ruth didn't answer immediately. She stared out the window at the yellow maple tree, its leaves falling like a worn-out curtain. "Because someone had to," she said quietly. And then, "Because you're here." Harry said nothing, but that day he didn't leave right away. He stayed until the bell rang. They sat in silence, listening to the wind scrape against the shutters, watching the ashes of the leaves drift down. It wasn't a world, it was the beginning of a shift, subtle, almost imperceptible, but important, and it was already irreversible. The morning after the final literature assignment was due, Ruth Evans woke up before dawn. A cold February fog spread across the sky outside, and the outlines of Ashwood's rooftops barely peeked through, as though the town itself was trying to hide from the coming day. She sat in the kitchen, holding a cup of weak coffee that barely warmed her hands. Harry's papers lay on the table, covered in his bold, impatient handwriting. The essay topic, "The Price of Truth in a World of Lies," would have sounded daring coming from any 16-year-old. But in her classroom, within these walls in this town, it felt almost revolutionary. Ruth read the paper over several times. He hadn't just grasped the essence of the novel. He had drawn parallels between the text and a reality he had refused to acknowledge before. In his words, for the first time, there was no contempt. It was a voice no one had heard before, his own. But it was still early. As the city slowly began to stir, dark clouds gathered over the walls of St. Augustine. By the time Ruth entered the school building, the air was thick with something unsettling. The hallway, usually echoing with the sound of a student's footsteps, was unusually quiet. Glances that once slid off her with cold indifference now burned. Some colleagues, Sylvia Haynes in particular, turned away, pretending not to notice her in the teacher's lounge. Principal John Kramer was waiting for her in his office. The room, which usually smelled of old leather and tobacco, was filled with a sense of anxiety today. He sat with his back straight, fingers interlocked, staring out the window. When Ruth entered, he turned to face her, as though it took effort, and said, "There's an emergency meeting of the parent council tonight. The reason, your work with Harry Miller." She nodded silently. Her face remained calm, but inside everything clenched. She didn't need an explanation to know who had called this meeting. Senator Walter Miller was a man of action. He was used to having his word become law, especially in places like Ashwood. White, insular, and overly confident in their rightness. Upon learning that his son hadn't just worked with a black teacher, but had written an essay with her help that other teachers had read and praised, Miller took it as a personal affront. The hours before the meeting dragged by. Classes were held in tense silence. Harry's classmates exchanged looks, whispered, some snickered when they glanced his way. A few, like Joanna Bates and Tommy Levis, openly mocked him, throwing jabs like, "Hey, Miller, you joining the NRACP now?" Harry didn't respond. He sat quietly, eyes downcast, but he never came late and never tried to skip class. During lunch, a history teacher approached him, speaking to him quietly, probably offering some sort of warning. Then in the hallway, he ran into his father. The encounter seemed accidental at first. Walter Miller arrived at the school earlier than expected. His tall figure, in a gray coat and hat, seemed out of place in the school hallway, like a shadow from another time. He looked at his son coldly and said sharply, "We'll talk at home." Harry didn't answer. He just nodded. But this time, there was no submissiveness in it. His face showed no fear, only exhaustion. By evening, the school's auditorium was packed like it hadn't been since the Christmas concert. Parents, many of them in suits and modest hats, sat in folding chairs, as if they were at a play, each one expecting to see the conclusion of a drama they had already decided on. John Kramer paced nervously across the stage. He wasn't a bad man, but he feared more than anything the idea of being on the wrong side. He didn't know how to resist pressure. In places like Ashwood, this quality was called wisdom. Ruth sat in the front row. She wore a stern dark dress, her hair neatly pinned back. She didn't pay attention to the whispers or the glances. She wasn't looking for support. In these battles, you either endure or you disappear. When Kramer gave the floor to Senator Miller, he stepped onto the stage with the air of a man who knew the victory was already his. His speech was carefully crafted. He spoke about tradition, the quality of education, the school's responsibility to the parents, to the taxpayers. He never once said the words color or race, but every word screamed them. He spoke of questionable teaching methods, of interfering with a student's personal development, of influencing family values. The crowd nodded, some applauded, others cleared their throats in approval. When Kramer offered Ruth a chance to speak, there was a slight rustle, like someone had just shrugged off the awkward cloak of discomfort. But she didn't rise. A whisper spread through the crowd, and then, unexpectedly, Harry stood up. He turned toward his father, and then to the audience. His voice trembled at first, but it steadied, like a rope being pulled taut. "You're all saying she influenced me. That's true. She taught me to see what I didn't want to see. That being right isn't the same as being loud. That truth isn't what's convenient. He didn't speak like a child, nor like a puppet. He spoke like a person. His father tried to interrupt, but Harry continued. You're not afraid of her. You're afraid that your kids might start thinking for themselves. The room fell silent. Kramer didn't stop him because he didn't know how. In that moment, the school, for just a second, ceased to be part of the old world. That evening back at home, Ruth sat in the silence. Outside, the barking of dogs and the creaking of wheels could be heard. On her desk lay an envelope without a stamp or return address. Inside was a short note. I heard. Thank you. There was no signature, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Beside it was a copy of Harry's essay, the one she kept. Outside, the wind turned the pages of spring, softly and without a sound, like a voice that had finally been heard. The sun on that May day in Ashwood blazed down as if the sky itself was shouting spring into the ears of anyone who didn't want to hear it. The air felt thick, saturated with the scent of freshly mown grass and gasoline from the cars of parents arriving for the graduation ceremony at St. Augustine Preparatory School. The narrow brick road leading up to the main building gleamed from the heat, and the white columns at the entrance seemed to absorb not just the light, but the tension that had built up in the school's walls over the past year. Ruth Evans stood by the window of her classroom, watching as a wooden stage was set up on the lawn in front of the building, along with chairs, school crests, and old-fashioned microphones that seemed to belong to another time, one desperately clinging to the past. She wore a blue dress, sharply cut, her only reminder of her teaching days back in Norfolk, where she had been loved and respected. Here in Ashwood, the fabric of the same dress felt out of place. It was like armor on a battlefield where the fight wasn't over, but enough damage had already been done. The room was quiet, despite the buzzing of the school outside the window. The chalkboard in front of her still bore the scars of past scribblings, words scrawled in haste and anger. Though the writing had long been erased, the board's wood held on to those marks like skin-holding scars. She ran her hand across the smooth surface and picked up a piece of chalk. Her hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the kind of exhaustion that only comes after a long inner battle. Then, holding her breath, she wrote, "Truth doesn't need skin color to be heard." The words settled on the board cleanly, sharply. The whiteness of the chalk stood out against the dark green of the board, a symbol of the opposite, the silence that somehow still resonates. She stepped back, read the phrase again, not as a teacher, but as a witness to something much bigger than just a school year. In the school halls, there was a buzz of excitement. Graduates in blue robes with ivory cords laughed, took photos, discussed their evening plans, and occasionally a parent would cast a glance at Ruth, a glance that mixed cold judgment, disdain, and something close to fear. They weren't used to her presence. She didn't fit in, not just because of her skin, but because she hadn't stepped aside. In that, she reminded them not of a new order, but of the fact that the old one was dying, and it wasn't dying on their terms. Among the crowd, Harry stood out. His robe hung awkwardly on him. He had grown so much in the past few months. His hair was cut short, accentuating the sharp line of his jaw, and his face no longer carried that patronizing look she had come to expect. In his eyes was the fatigue of an adult, no longer a boy's, but that of someone who, for the first time in his life, had made a choice without asking his father's permission. Senator Walter Miller, as expected, didn't show up. His absence was felt just as loudly as if he'd been standing in the front row. He lost not because the school sided with Ruth. In fact, most still remained either hostile or indifferent. He lost because he couldn't hold on to the one thing that mattered most, his son, whose independence had struck harder than any vote ever could. The ceremony began and everything unfolded as usual. The national anthem, Principal Kramer's speech, dry, vague, and not once mentioning the events of the past few months. He talked about traditions, academic excellence, eternal values, Not a word about conflict, struggle, or pain. He acted as if everything was the same. And most of the crowd, the parents, the teachers, the graduates, acted as though they believed it. But that time had passed. When the diplomas were handed out, Ruth stayed off to the side. She hadn't taught every graduate, and she wasn't invited to the stage. She didn't need the formalities. She watched as students, one by one, approached the stage. Most passed by without a glance. Some dropped their eyes. Only a few nodded quietly, and one even shook her hand. That was enough. When Harry Miller's name was called, a tense silence settled over the room. He stepped up to the stage, took his diploma, and, without leaving, walked over to the microphone. This was not planned. Principal Kramer froze, clearly wanting to intervene, but something in Harry's face stopped him. "Some of us were taught more than what's in textbooks," Harry said. His voice was steady. "There are teachers who don't just explain. They fight, not for themselves, but for us." He didn't mention her name, but there was no need. Everyone understood. Some people in the audience whispered, others shook their heads. One parent stood up and left. But most stayed silent, listening, and Ruth stood in the shadows of the trees, unmoving. After the ceremony, the students dispersed. Photos, congratulations, the usual chaos. Harry was the last to approach her. He didn't smile. He just handed her a folded sheet of paper, wordlessly. Ruth took it, unfolded it. "You gave me a voice. Thank you." She stared at those words written in neat, almost calligraphic handwriting, and only then allowed herself to falter. The sky was clear. The wind played with the maple leaves. For a moment the school seemed less cold. Later, as she returned to her classroom, the evening sun was casting long shadows across the board. The chalk in her hand still felt warm. She read the phrase she had written that morning one more time. Then, without erasing it, she carefully added underneath, "And sometimes, truth needs to be spoken out loud, even if not everyone is ready to hear it." The chalk crumbled to the floor. Ruth sat at her desk. She knew the school hadn't changed, not completely, but she also knew this. Harry Miller would never be the same. And maybe, just maybe, he would be the beginning of something that once seemed impossible. Because truth doesn't need skin color. But sometimes it needs someone's courage.